It happened on an ordinary Sunday, the kind where sunlight drifts through stained glass in quiet stripes and the air smells faintly of lemon polish and old hymnals. I was standing at the back pew holding the collection plate like I'd done every week for almost 15 years, when I noticed it, a plain white envelope, thicker than any tithe I'd ever seen, heavy in a way that made my wrist tense, the corner sealed tight, no name. No handwriting, just the faint dent of a pen pressed hard enough to leave a ghost line, but not a word. I almost set it aside for the treasurer, but something in me paused. Curiosity, maybe, or the unease that comes when something feels slightly wrong in a place that's supposed to be pure. I waited until the last hymn faded and the congregation began to trickle out, Mrs. Keller with her hat crooked from nodding too hard during the sermon, the Donovans arguing softly about whether to stop for pie or go straight home. Reverend Paul shaking hands by the door with that practiced warmth he never seemed to lose. When the sanctuary was nearly empty, I slipped the envelope into my cardigan pocket, telling myself I'd bring it straight to the office after helping tidy the pews. But as I carried the stack of hymnals back to the shelves, the thought kept pressing at me like a small heartbeat in my pocket. Who leaves that kind of money without a note, and why? When I finally stepped outside, the spring air hit my face cool and bright. The kind of day that makes you believe in second chances. I could see my breath when I exhaled, and I remember thinking, even the air feels honest today. I should be too. Still, I didn't go to Reverend Paul. I went home instead, walking slow past the lilacs by the gate, feeling the envelope tap against my side. I told myself I'd only hold onto it overnight, just to think, just to be sure it wasn't meant for something else. But by the time I put the kettle on and laid it on my kitchen table, the weight of it felt more like a secret than a duty. I made tea, chamomile like always, and stared at the seal until the steam blurred my glasses. The kettle clicked off, the clock ticked loud. And somewhere in that silence, I made the first small wrong decision that would ripple through every quiet corner of my life. By evening, the sun had faded to that soft amber color that makes everything in my kitchen look kinder, the chipped mugs, the folded newspaper, even the dust on the windowsill. I'd lived alone for 11 years since Harold passed, long enough for silence to stop feeling like punishment and start feeling like company. My days were predictable in the way that comfort and loneliness often share the same furniture. Breakfast at 7, the crossword I never finished. The walk to the church on Maple Street where I volunteered twice a week. I liked it there. The routine, the rhythm, the smallness of its worries, fixing hymnals, counting envelopes, folding bulletins. Tasks that made me feel useful without demanding too much of what I didn't have left. Reverend Paul often said the Lord didn't need grand gestures, just quiet faithfulness. I believed him, maybe because quiet was all I had left to give. That night I made soup, poured it into one bowl, and sat where Harold used to sit. The envelope still on the table beside me like an uninvited guest. Every few minutes I'd glance at it as though it might explain itself. I tried to eat, but each spoonful tasted like questions. What if it was an honest mistake? What if someone needed it back tonight? What if it was part of a larger donation I'd ruined by meddling? I could already hear Reverend Paul's gentle but disappointed voice. Margaret, you know better than to take church matters home, and still I couldn't bring myself to drive back and drop it in the office slot. Something held me, maybe the same instinct that made me keep my husband's watch even though it stopped ticking 10 years ago. A need to hold on to something I didn't yet understand. The next morning I woke before the alarm, the sky still pale with the kind of quiet that feels borrowed. I made coffee and brought the envelope to the table again. I thought maybe it'd feel lighter after a night's sleep. It didn't. I took a knife and carefully slit the seal just enough to peek inside, and there it was. Bills, thick, neatly folded, 20s mostly, maybe hundreds, the faint smell of paper and perfume. No note, no check stub, no receipt. I didn't count them, I couldn't. The sight alone made my stomach turn. I closed it quickly and whispered a prayer I wasn't sure how to finish. Lord, what am I supposed to do? At 10, I went to church like always. The sanctuary was empty, but for the echo of my shoes on the old floor. I left the bulletin stack on the front pew and tried to focus on cleaning the candle holders. My hands moved, but my mind didn't. I kept replaying that moment the plate came to me, the way it had sat heavy on my palm. How no one in the row looked nervous or guilty, just the usual faces, Mr. Hartwith. His ever-bobbing nods, the Millers sharing a hymnal though they owned two, young Claire Walker near the aisle with her little boy fidgeting beside her, his small fingers playing with the hem of her sleeve. She was new to town, quiet, maybe 30. Came every Sunday no matter how tired she looked. I'd once overheard her telling the Reverend she was between jobs, that she cleaned houses when she could and prayed for steady work. She reminded me of my daughter before she moved away, the same kind of gentle exhaustion that comes from carrying too much alone. Around noon I locked up and headed to the grocery store. The day felt too bright for my thoughts, and that's where I saw her, Claire, standing by the customer service counter, talking in a voice tight with panic. The clerk nodding politely, shaking her head. Claire was holding her purse open, hands trembling. I caught fragments of her words. Rent money, envelope. Dropped it somewhere. I retraced every step, her boy tugging at her sleeve. Asking for juice, my heart stopped cold. I didn't need more than that to know. It had to be hers. The same morning, the same shape, the same amount of fear that could fill an envelope to bursting. I stood frozen by the cereal aisle. The universe folding in on itself. I felt both the weight of the envelope still waiting on my kitchen table and the terrible pull of her voice across the store. Lord, what test is this? I whispered, but heaven stayed quiet. It usually does when you already know the answer you don't want to hear. I walked toward the counter before I had decided what to say, my feet moving like they belonged to a braver woman. Claire turned and tried to smile. That small practiced smile poor people use so they don't scare kindness away. She said, "Hi, Miss Margaret." I forced steadiness into my voice and asked, "Is everything all right?" She swallowed and said, "I lost my rent money. All of it. I had it in a plain envelope because my landlord doesn't take checks. It must have fallen out of my purse at church or here. I've looked everywhere." The clerk said, "If someone turns it in, we'll call. But you know how it is. Cash grows legs." I heard the tiniest crack in her voice then, a sound like a teacup handle snapping. She said, "My rent is due tomorrow. If I don't pay, I'm out by Friday." I opened my mouth and 100 choices crowded the doorway. Tell her I had it. Tell her to wait. Tell the clerk to call the police. Tell Reverend Paul. Tell no one and fix it myself. Each option glowed for a second and went dim because none of them were simple and all of them were wrong in some way. I told her I'd drive her back to the church to search even though I knew we wouldn't find what she'd lost in a pew. We walked the aisle slowly, checking under hymnals and kneelers like two women bargaining with a stubborn God. She kept apologizing for taking my time. I kept telling her time was all I had plenty of. She said it was cash from 3 small jobs and 1 big one she'd just finished. A deep clean for a rental house that left her back aching and her nails raw. She laughed once without humor and said if money had a smell it would be bleach. We searched until searching became a ritual instead of a task. Then we sat in the last pew. Her son Noah asleep on her shoulder, the sanctuary light making a soft halo of his hair. She said, "I hate that it was an envelope. That's like leaving it on a plate with a sign that says please take," and the word plate struck me like a bell. The collection plate, and I saw again my own hand slipping the envelope into my pocket like I could save something by hiding it. I walked her to the bus stop and promised to pray, which felt like offering a paper umbrella to a flood. Then I went home and put the envelope in front of me on the table like a verdict waiting to be read. I poured tea I didn't drink. I stared at Harold's old watch and asked it to start again. It didn't. I picked up the phone to call Reverend Paul, then set it down. Picked it up again, set it down. I thought about procedures and chain of custody and how the church treasurer would insist on logging the cash. I thought about how long that might take and how eviction papers don't wait for committee meetings. I thought about the way Claire held her boy like he was both anchor and sail, and I felt something in me harden and soften at the same time, a decision arriving on swollen feet. I counted the money because I had to, because math is a kind of confession. There was more than rent, enough to shore up a week or two of groceries and a late electric bill. I told myself a neat lie, that I was only holding it until morning so I could hand-deliver it to her before the landlord's office opened. I told myself I would go to the Reverend after and explain. I told myself intent was clean even if the method wasn't. I put the cash into a fresh envelope and wrote her name on the front. In my careful teacher cursive, then I wrote a note. Not from me, from nowhere. It said for rent. For now, pay it forward when you can. I stood in my hallway with my coat half on for a full minute because I could already feel the heat of my choice on my face like I'd stepped too close to the oven. I drove to Claire's apartment at dusk and sat in the car long enough to talk myself out of it twice. I watched the lights in the units flicker on like small prayers. I saw her silhouette in the kitchen. Window moving like a tired song, I got out, slipped the envelope under her door, knocked twice, and left before she answered because I was not brave enough to watch gratitude make a criminal out of me. At the corner, I heard her door open and her voice say hello, hello into the hallway like a person asking a question with all the answers inside it. I turned the wheel and went home through the longest route I could find so I'd have more time to prepare my confession for morning. That night I did. Not sleep. I lay in bed counting cracks in the ceiling and making bargains I knew I couldn't keep. I promised God I'd tell the Reverend everything as soon as the church office opened. I promised myself I'd accept the consequences with sturdy dignity. I promised Harold's photo on the dresser that integrity mattered more than appearances, and that I would not let this little town turn me into a story I didn't recognize. Around 3 a.m. I cried without sound because the older you get, the more you learn how to be quiet even when you're breaking. At dawn, I got up and made coffee I didn't want and looked out at the street where the early paper boy pedaled like hope in a sweatshirt. 89. I went to the church office and found Reverend Paul with his glasses slid down his nose reading the utility bill like it had personally offended him. I closed the door and said, I need to tell you something. He looked up with that pastoral patience I've always admired and feared. I told him about the envelope and the plate, about taking it home, about the grocery store, about Claire, about the knock and the hallway and how my feet ran when my conscience should have stood still. He didn't interrupt. He didn't even nod. He just listened like the sanctuary listens when you confess to an empty room. When I finished, he took off his glasses and folded them slowly. He said, Margaret, why didn't you bring it to me? And I said, because I was afraid you'd do the right thing in the wrong order. He blinked at that, so I kept talking. I said I knew you'd lock it up and call a meeting and verify and log and pray, and all the while a mother who comes here every Sunday would be pushed onto a sidewalk with her boy's backpack on her hip. I said I might have made a mistake, but I refused to make that one. He stared at his hands for a moment and then back at me. He said the church has procedures for a reason. We are stewards, not saviors, he said. People trust us to keep their offerings safe. I said, what good is safe if it sits in a file cabinet while someone drowns in the shallow end? He sighed and said, Margaret, I have to report this to the treasurer, to the board. We will need to replace the funds until we can determine their origin. His tone was not scolding. It was weary, the voice of a man who keeps books and souls and knows both are messy. I said I will replace it if I must. I will sell Harold's watch if I have to. But I will not apologize for triage. He shook his head gently and said, no one is asking you to sell your memories. We just need to tell the truth. I said, then let me tell it to Claire first. He paused, and in that pause I saw him weigh mercy against order. He said, all right. Together, now, before anyone else hears words without context. We drove to her apartment and knocked, and she opened the door with the look of someone who had cried hard and then slept the sleep of reprieve. She saw the Reverend and stepped aside as if grace itself had asked to come in. We sat at her little table with a chipped edge and a vase of 3 daisies, trying very hard to be a bouquet. I told her what I had done. I told her the money likely came through the plate by accident or confusion, and that I had given it to her because rent does not care about provenance. I told her the church would honor the gift as anonymous and ask no questions, but that we had to record it properly to keep the books honest before I could finish. She put her head in her hands and sobbed a sound I had only ever heard once before. The day I told my daughter her father was gone. Between sobs she kept saying thank you and I'm sorry and I'll pay it back, and I said no you won't, not to me. Pay it forward when you can to someone who needs their own Tuesday saved. Reverend Paul prayed then, a short prayer that did not try to teach God anything, and when he said amen he looked at me with eyes that had softened at the edges. He said we'll mark it as benevolence, anonymous, designated to rent relief. He said, "I'll take the heat with the board. That's my job." On the way back to the church, he said quietly, "This place asks us to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves." Some days I wish Jesus had given us a better animal. We both laughed, and then he told me to go home and rest my conscience. But consciences don't follow orders just because a reverend gives them. They linger, they replay. They bring up the fact that I opened an envelope that wasn't mine and made myself judge and jury because I didn't trust a system built on trust. By Wednesday, the story had leaked in that way small towns have perfected. The words changed shape as they moved from mouth to mouth. Some said a miracle happened. Others said a theft dressed up as charity. A few said Margaret finally lost her mind. At the next board meeting, Mrs. Keller asked if this set a precedent for bypassing proper channels whenever anyone cried in the cereal aisle. The treasurer fretted about liability and tax law as if Caesar were a member of the congregation. Reverend Paul read a short statement about compassion and stewardship and then, bless him, took responsibility for not training ushers better about unexpected gifts. I sat in the back and kept my face still, a skill cultivated over decades of faculty meetings and funerals. Afterward, he pressed my hand and said, "Go home the long way and look at the river. Water has a way of reminding us that straight lines are man-made." On Friday, an old man I barely knew stopped me outside the bakery and said, "You did right. My wife would have done the same." Then a woman I know too well from the quilting circle said, "You embarrass the church. If people can't trust us to handle money, how will they trust us with anything else?" I smiled at both like a politician because sometimes survival means letting other people be wrong about you without fixing it. That afternoon, a note appeared in my mailbox with no signature. It said, "I left that envelope in the plate on purpose. It was a tithe, God's money, not yours to redistribute." My hands shook and then steadied. I read it twice. I looked for clues in the loops of letters and found none. I carried it to the Reverend and watched him read it with a face that could not decide between anger and sadness. He said, "If this is true, they can come to me and say it with a name. Otherwise it is wind." I asked, "What if it is true?" He said, "Then we will gently teach them that tithes feed hungry people, sometimes by policy and sometimes by the holy inconvenience of a woman who cannot watch a child sleep in a car." Sunday came again like it always does, ready or not. The sanctuary was full of that soft murmur of people trying not to confess their gossip breath. I stood at the back with the plate and felt no nobility at all. Only the exposed feeling of a person who has been both praised and scolded and suspects both are mildly deserved. The music started and my hands remembered how to be ordinary. We passed the plate and it came back lighter than usual. Fear has a way of making generosity nervous. When I set it on the table in the office later, I saw another plain envelope sitting there already. This one with a note folded on top. It said, "For whoever needs it most. No questions, anonymous." I did not open it. I called the treasurer in and asked her to count it with me. We did, and she cried a little without saying why. Later, Claire found me by the side door and handed me a tiny envelope of her own, 5 crumpled singles and a note that said "Week 1." I hugged her and put it straight into the benevolence box because that is how you turn mercy into a habit instead of a headline. That afternoon, I sat on my porch and watched clouds gather over the river. I thought about rules and hearts and how the longest distance in any church is often the 10 feet between the offering plate and the person who needs it. I thought about Harold's watch and how I haven't wound it in years and how it still measures something even if not time. Maybe faith, maybe stubbornness. I thought about the note writer who wanted their tithe to be pure and untouched by human fingers, and how money like that is like seed left in a sack, safe, unspent, unplanted. I decided if they came to me with a name, I would apologize for the method and not for the mercy. And if they never did, I would keep passing plates and sweeping pews and trusting that God is better at accounting than I am at obedience. Late in the evening, there was a knock. Rev Paul stood there with a pie from Mrs. Donovan and a smile that said he'd been at 3 difficult homes already and had one left in him. He said the board will be loud for a while and then it will forget why it was shouting. He said Claire met with the deacons and we've set up a small fund for emergency rent and utilities. Anonymous gifts only, no red tape. 2 signatures required. He said I'd like yours to be one of them. I felt something open in my ribs like a window finally unstuck. I said you trust me after all this. He said if grace can't learn from a misstep, then it isn't grace. I took the pie and the pen and signed where he pointed, and then I signed in my own heart a promise to be braver and slower, and to bring envelopes straight to the office, even if my feet want to run toward the nearest emergency. And also to keep a little cash in my pocket for when the nearest emergency is standing in front of me with a broken teacup voice. When I went to bed that night, I set Harold's watch on the nightstand and nudged the hands forward to the right time even, though they would fall back again by morning. I whispered a prayer that was more gratitude than grammar, and I slept, not like the innocent, but like the forgiven, which is better, because innocence is a thing you lose, and forgiveness is a thing you can keep giving away.